since I'm just showing now, that this is based a lot on this book, Buddhism in Contemporary American Poetry. I do, as was mentioned, I do have a master's in creative writing, which was mostly poetry. And as I said, again, we'll break into groups, I think about 3 people, and I'll have you analyze some poems. Basically, as I was saying, so Buddhism came to the United States just through the Transcendentalists, but then it came again, and there wasn't much going on, and then it came again in 1897 through T.D. Suzuki. Came to San Francisco. And that was another influx of, or I'm not using the right word. But basically, what happened in American poetry really happened mostly in the 1950s. And that was through the beats. How many people have heard of the beat poets? Good, a lot of people. Great, great, great. And there were 2 strands. There really is no Buddhist poetics. I use that word in the title. That's not completely accurate. But there are 2 main influences, how you're going to find Buddhism, and I'm going to ask you to analyze a couple poems. One is through what I would call imagist poetry. And a good example of that comes from Ezra Pound. How many people have heard of Ezra Pound? Good. He was a poet, American poet living in Europe. Unfortunately, he sided with the fascists, but that was just his own decision. When we were in World War II, he sided with the Italians. But he had a great influence on American poetry. And here's an example. I'm going to read one example, and then I'm going to ask the people on Zoom to use this example when we break in the group. So I'm going to give you each a poem or 2 to analyze. But Pound's poem is very short. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. I'll read it again. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. That was one style, which was supposed to stop the mind from linear thinking and just kind of interrupt that. Let me see, I have a good quote. Excuse me? It was to stop the mind from like
okay, can you read it?
Oh, okay, sure. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. And it basically was
what?
Black bough, B-O-U-G-H. Am I pronouncing it incorrectly? Yeah. And it was basically like haiku. So the influence of Zen came through haiku, Chinese poetry, came through Japanese poetry. The Zen took off a lot in Japan and India. Let me read some stuff that this is about the beats that I'm going to read. The beats were uninspired by the wordy, speculative, and metaphysical interpretations of some Buddhist scholars, but tended to accept the tougher dialect of Zen. You may have heard this phrase, but you may not have. If you see the Buddha, kill him. A doctrine that originated in the Buddha's remarks that the ultimate was unimaginable. So it's like Yeah, I mean, if you see the Buddha kill him, I mean, that sounds pretty radical now, but it wasn't so much in the 60s. Because did you ever hear that phrase? Well, it was a doctrine that people did speak. So in Renze, and if I pronounce something, I apologize. In Renze Zen meditation, a paradoxical koan or problem released the mind from the limits of logic. So that was that haiku that, or I would call that an imagist poem that I read that Pound wrote. The faces on a black, what you remember, the apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black cloud. So it was that strain of poetry that was just supposed to disrupt the mind from logical thinking and just like a koan. A koan, example of a koan is one hand clapping. Like what's the sound of one hand clapping? Have people heard that before? It's supposed to disrupt. Do you know the sound of one hand clapping? No. But, I mean, some people really try to figure out what is that sound? So poetry came out of, there was that strain. So there are two strains. And one is just talking about the most important things that Buddhism offers us, which is basically the most important ideas, which is impermanence. Where did I write them down? Impermanence and nirvana, or the way. Interconnectedness. Thich Nhat Hanh speaks a lot about that. Emptiness, that was already mentioned today. And no self. So those are themes that you'll find in narrative poetry. Let me see, I'm gonna read a few more things and then I'm gonna give you an idea of what to look for when we break up into groups. I'm gonna ask you to look at two things. Look at the form of the poem. It's just simple. Are the lines long? Are they short? Do they use punctuation? Does it rhyme? What's the form? And then what's the content? What's the poem saying? Like this poem, the one I read a few times already, the apparition of the faces in a crowd, petals on a wet black bough. May not mean anything, but it's just going to be an exploration. There's no right answers. Let me see a couple more things I just want to say. So, let's see, most of the leading Japanese haiku poets were Zenists, which means they practice Zen. And the form's origin and development is interwoven in the history and ontology of Zen. The haiku is structured so that the mind is thus led towards an intuitive recognition of mind, the Buddha nature, as undifferentiated. So it's almost like a sudden awareness, oneness through the fusion of two, and I'm using big words here because I copied this, ontologically equivalent yet manifestly diverse images across the thought pause into a powerfully aesthetically complete moment. So all that's saying is there's two things you have to grapple with. And like, again, I'm repeating this poem a few times. The apparition of these faces in the crowd. What is that? The apparition. What does apparition mean? Kind of like, does anybody know? Do we have to look it up on Google?
A vision.
Kind of like a vision. The apparition.
Of a person.
Say again?
It's a vision of a person.
I don't know. It could be. I'm not sure, but it's certainly a vision. The apparition of these faces in the crowd. So he's having and he's equating it with these petals on a wet black bough. I mean, it's a strange, you think, well, that doesn't really make sense, but that's one of the ideas, that it doesn't really, it's more of an image. So again, I'm going to ask people to go in groups of 3, and I want to ask one person in the group to focus on form. Look at the form, comment on the form of the poem. The other person comment on the content. Does it say anything about impermanence, emptiness? You know, I'll give you one more example because I just left with one, but let me read one that I like. And I may give this out as a poem too, so I'm helping people out. This is a poem from Allen Ginsberg. And okay. Where is the title of it? Okay. I have to look it up, but this is the poem. Give me one second. Let me give you the title. So, and Ginsberg also believed first thought, best thought, and don't make things formal. That's what that was the power of the 60s, that Ginsberg and the other poets were saying anything that came to mind. And I'll give you an example of one of his poems, that it's why I meditate. Here's the poem. I sit because the Dadaist screamed on Mirror Street. I sit because the Surrealists ate angry pillows. I sit because the Imagists breathed calmly in Rutherford and Manhattan. I sit because 2,400 years. I sit in America because Buddha saw a corpse in Lumbini. I sit because the yippies whooped up Chicago's tear gas skies once. I sit because I sit because I was unable to trace the unborn back to the womb. I sit because it's easy. I sit because I get angry if I don't. I sit because they told me to. I sit because I read it in the funny papers. I sit because I had a vision, also dropped LSD. I sit because I don't know what else to do, like Peter Orlovsky. I sit because after Lunacharsky got fired and Stalin gave Zandovo a special tennis court, I became a rootless cosmopolitan. I sit inside the shell of the old me. I sit for world revolution. So it's just like a rant. I think that's all I'm going to say. I'm going to ask people to form groups of 3 and try to sit with somebody you don't know that well, just so it's more fun. And remember, one person's going to look at form, one person's going to look at content, and then the third person is going to basically say if this poem reminds them of something, or if it has any, it's kind of similar to the content one, but we're going to keep it as a separate. So if it reminds you of anything, even as strange as it could be. So I'm going to hand out some poems. And a couple of these are mine. 2 are mine. I may give 2 to a group. So let's get into groups of 3. Could you just self-select yourselves?